Well, thank you so much to everybody that's joining us. We have an amazing guest with us today, someone who is not only a colleague and a member of my coaching cohort when I went through iPEC, but someone who has become a dear friend and someone who I revere and have such respect for because of everything that they are putting out into this world with their energy. And this is Deb Stelatto, and I'm excited to introduce you to her. Even though we are good friends and I know her very well, I'm still going to look at the notes to make sure that I get them all right. So excuse me while I turn to the notes. And again, while I have you, let's just give a quick introduction to Energy Explorers Live. It is our mission at iPEC to raise the consciousness of the world one person at a time. And not only are we certified coaches, we are a conscious community of helpers with big hearts and amazing stories. This series gets us the opportunity to share how our coaches are using their talents, their drive, and their highest selves in order to live their purpose. Getting to the heart of what it really means to be a certified professional coach and explore the journeys that we all experience. And without further ado, I get to introduce my friend Deb. Deb is a nonprofit CEO turned coach who specializes in coaching other nonprofit leaders. She's the founder of the Think Good Company and hosts an amazing podcast called the Think Courageously podcast with Deb Cu. If you are not already a subscriber, I highly recommend it. The podcast is all about the lessons learned from courageous women, and she has had the opportunity to share the stories of so many amazing women, including her own story. So that's a little plug. She is one of this, we're really excited about. She's one of 14 individuals who is featured in an upcoming book called Elevate Your Voice that comes out April 6th. I think that's my second plug, Deb. That must be my PR background. But without further ado, we are going to jump into this really important conversation because, of course, at iPEC, we talk about energy. Everything is energy. And there's no good or bad. It just is. But one of the things I know, Deb, that you were sharing with us is that you've really noticed, especially in the work that you do in the nonprofit sector, that energy is depleted right now. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing and how that kind of mirrors what's going on in the greater universe.
Well, Carla, it's amazing to be here with you. And, I just feel so honored because iPEC has been such an important, enormous part of my life in the last 3 years. And I'll just say this for those of you who might be new, which is that our cohort group, my cohort group has stayed together for 3 years, and we had a call 2 nights ago. And wow, it was incredible and amazing. But this concept of depleted is something that I've been spending a lot of time with my clients on. And as you alluded to, Carla, I am very fortunate to work with many nonprofit leaders. I've worked with 40 to 50 different organizations over the last 3 years. And the work that I do is pretty specific. I do coaching, one-on-one coaching with executives, mostly executives who are new to their roles or who work in small organizations and who often experience a lot of loneliness, imposter syndrome. There's always a question of their competence and their confidence. And so I always start with using the ELI as a way to open that conversation and see where people are energetically. And I think what's fascinating about this group of people, and I'm trying to figure out how to gather the data for this, is that in general, the energetic profile of many of the people that are my clients, and I also coach many women, is very a high level 4 profile. Mm-hmm. You don't end up running a nonprofit if you don't have tons of love, care, and concern, and if you're not showing up from that heart-centered space. So people come into this work with a lot of level 4 energy. And what they experience, though, and I think what has been really emphasized over the last 2 years is that showing up with that level 4 energy without that self-care piece of things is this very prevalent trend that I'm seeing, where we're going right from a 4 down spiraling to a 1 or a 2. And people just being really stuck at those catabolic levels of energy.
I mean, so much of that makes sense, right? If you are going into the nonprofit sector, it is coming from a heart space, and we know that is around that level 4. And that always so curious to me, right? Because level 4 is all about caring for others. And their self-care piece is part of that, but it's often the part that gets overlooked. And then you've got that frustration because well, talk to me a little bit about that frustration. I'm sort of interpreting what I think that frustration is based in, but you've seen it sort of on the front line. So how does that frustration show up? Where is that coming from?
Well, I think it comes up from this place of empathy. And what's happened is, when we started 2 years ago with the pandemic, I think there was a very much, there have been so many stressors, right, over the last 2 years, just an unimaginable number of stressors. And that's not just true for nonprofit leaders. I coach mostly women, and I've seen this with women in other sectors as well. But in the nonprofit sector, what happens is that empathy extends to a phenomenon that's happened over the 2 years in nonprofits, which is that we're serving more and more and more clients. The result of the pandemic, as we all know, has had such an impact on mental health issues, but it's also impacted other larger, major societal problems like homelessness and hunger. And so the doors, as my clients say, were blown open. So they're needing to serve more people. They're needing to deal with internal surges in the pandemic. I have one client who is a shelter for women who are victims of domestic violence. They had to close their shelter because their staff got sick. They've had to close their shelter because their residents got sick. And they've had to approach their work in really unique ways, which has given many of them an opportunity to think at level 5 and above. But it's been continuous. So they've experienced that continuously. And then, quite honestly, what I've seen recently is just a major down spiraling of energy around what's going on in the world globally with the war. And again, these are folks who care deeply. And so they're not able to move anywhere else. They're very much stuck in that empathetic response that is overwhelm. It's overwhelm is how it's showing up, and exhaustion. And it's interesting. I happened to find this weekend, and I've been talking about this topic a little bit this week, but this is not just me observing this. This is, if you're reading literature, I read Harvard Business Review and McKinsey and Company reports. From March 25th, one of the articles in HBR in Harvard Business Review was about leading an exhausted workforce. And so I think what we're experiencing is cumulative exhaustion, cumulative stress, and cumulative grief. And it's really taking its toll on people.
And as leaders, and as people at the top, not only does the energy sort of flow downward, but where are they turning to get, trying to think of the right word, to fill their cup, right? You can't pour from an empty cup. And if they're depleted, there's nothing left to give. Right. So it's a little bit of a really bad cycle. So it makes a lot of sense that there's low energy. And if there's no energy flowing from the top, what's happening with the rest of that organization?
Right.
Yeah. And so as someone who is in that space, engaging with these individuals, where do you start?
Yeah, I think that's where we have such an opportunity as iPEC coaches, and such a distinguishing opportunity using the ELI and using doing energy work with people. I find that people really grab and gravitate to this model, gravitate to our model.
Mm-hmm.
And it's implementatable. That's not a word. I don't know. But they're able to really identify with this model, and not just as an individual, but as an organization. And so I think, we can start looking in the way that, Bruce wrote, Energy Leadership, at what's going on in nonprofit organizations. And we can see some trends there. And I think once we start talking about this, once we talk about the cup and setting boundaries, we're able to raise our consciousness about what's going on. And so showing up at level 4 is magical and wonderful. And it's, thank goodness, right? Because I'm a social worker. And so that level 4 energy is a space for me where I feel like I'm doing some of my best work. And, right, my favorite 3-letter word. And if we're not in that place of self-care, which is then what I work with my clients on, like, well, what does that self-care look like? What do boundaries look like? How are you using your toolkit to really understand those boundaries and serve people in an even more powerful way as an advocate, in a place of opportunity, in a place of synergy? What does that look like? And so we literally walk through up and down. We take that adventure and walk up and down that model in how they're showing up and how is that serving them as a leader.
Toolkit. That's the word that sort of just jumped out at me. Because, as we talk in terms of having more conscious awareness, when that doesn't exist, we're just moving through life, right? And kind of one foot in front of the other. And we, just reacting instead of responding, which it sounds like a lot of these individuals have to, especially as you were saying, over the last couple of years, there wasn't, almost in a sense, there wasn't any time to respond. It was just reaction. And especially coming from that heart space, we've got to do more. We've got to help more people, and just taking all of that on. But now that you've got that opportunity to sit and take that step back and make a more sort of have more awareness of what that's doing and how that energy is kind of draining, you take that space to think, well, what can I do differently? And so that's when you said toolkit. It's like, okay, let's talk a little bit more about that toolkit. So what are I heard self-care, I heard boundaries. What are some of those? Talk me through some of these tools that you offer to the folks that you're working with.
I think the awareness and then the practical pieces, right? So people keeping an energy journal and then debriefing about what they're, finding in that energy journal. We talk a lot about creating spaciousness in your life and what that looks like and redefining that. And, sometimes I think it can be as simple as how we show up in our meetings and how certain situations are evoking our that chain response that we have to things, and how we can really choose how we want to show up in meetings in the nonprofit world. It can be with our staff, it can be with donors, it can be with other nonprofit leaders in a space of collaboration. So really beginning with the end in mind. And so my coaching focuses on integrating a lot of different tools. I'm a big fan of Stephen Covey. Obviously, I'm an iPEC coach. I do a lot of work around whole brain thinking, how you can think differently about situations. And I'm a lifelong leadership geek. So I bring a lot of those models to the toolkit for people to consider and to practice and really use that within both my one-on-one coaching and my group coaching processes.
You bring so much to the table. And so it's not just one specific thing. And this has been a career journey for you. You didn't just jump right into this. You've been working in the nonprofit space, both as a CEO yourself, and then as a consultant, and now as sort of all of those things as a coach. And I'm curious, what changed for you in your approach after going through iPEC? Because I remember being with you, and it was like this revelation. And so I'm just curious, just on a more granular level, how you show up differently in this role, having gone through the program.
Such a great question. And I remember like the moment that that happened for me in my, I think it was probably mod two, but I can't remember. Sherry was there and a woman who's an organizational development specialist. And I was like in this place of challenging her at the time because I wanted to be right about being a consultant, because I called myself a consultant at that time. And I really thought, and there's a lot of work that I've done on myself around some of my limiting beliefs and my own gremlins about being the expert in the room. And I was having, a challenge thinking about dropping that title of expert. I had been a CEO of a large nonprofit. I had actually been an interim CEO. I had been a volunteer, a board member. And, my mindset was like the only way I could do leadership work was through a place of being an expert. When I realized that coaching would always come first, and coaching was the construct that would open the door to the most impactful conversations I could have with people as a consultant, it was monumental. And oftentimes in the work that I do, I clarify when I'm coming out of that coaching hat into a consulting hat and an advisor hat, because my clients sometimes do require the technical skill and competency information that they need to be successful as a nonprofit leader, which I put in my toolbox over many years. But being aware of the difference and honoring the difference between being a coach, being a consultant, being a facilitator was incredibly impactful for me and happened, smack dab in the middle of my iPEC training. And I had to do a lot of my own pivoting, which has become my word, right? A lot of pivoting around myself and my business and my life and how I was going to show up.
You just brought up so much there in one statement. That the difference, right? The subtle, and it's not that subtle, but it is for some, the difference between consulting and coaching. To me, there's a little bit of freedom in shifting over, not having to be the expert and not having to come up with the answers. That is that bit of an exhale, and it gives you almost permission to just be curious. And I come back to that word that you used before, spaciousness. So creating that spaciousness for yourself in those moments so that you too can be, creative and broader thinking instead of always being one step ahead with that answer. And A-N-D, small word, and at the same time, being able to shift and pivot into that consulting role. And I've had conversations with individuals who are thinking about coach training and struggling with those two things, right? Because they have this experience and expertise that they want to draw on. But if I'm a coach, can I not do that? So it's great to hear how you're able to even just sort of, pivot in the same conversation, as long as you are explaining in that moment. I'm guessing that, okay, not taking my coaching hat off, but, being able to come from both places, out of integrity and when the situation calls for it.
Yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive as long as you are clear with your clients on, how you're using those labels. And I think for me, the word is freeing, 100%, so much more freeing. And I feel like what I'm able to do by letting go of that need to be the Mrs. Fix-It or the expert in the room is that I do show up much more curious and I'm fully present. And, I love that. Like it's amazing experience to be able to be part of that conversation. I never would have gotten here. It's what's interesting is I decided to become a coach because I thought I needed that in my toolbox as a consultant. What I actually learned was almost the opposite. When you start with coaching, people will probably trust you. In my field, people come to me because I have so much experience and I've built my practice around helping so many diverse organizations. That doesn't mean that's what they want from me. They're attracted to me, they're drawn to me, they trust me in that role as an expert, but really what they are looking for is the coaching experience.
Mm. And we'll, how you show up in one area of your life is how you often show up in all of them. And, we talk a little bit about that too, in the sense that, you have a niche, and people are drawn to you because of that niche. But what I'm hearing is that when they show up on their phone call or their Zoom or in your office, that it may be about something completely different than what's happening in the office. How often do you find that happening for you?
I think it's always because we show up as our whole person and, as our whole selves. And I think when we're in a place of doing this work, I do so much work around alignment and values that those things can't live independently of your personal life and your work life. They have to be integrated. And when we feel stressed because we don't have that alignment, that's when we have to do the digger digging and excavation on things.
Yeah. And so I want to shift a little bit, because there's so many elements to the Think Good company, the work that you're doing, the work on the front lines that you're doing right now in terms of energy with not-for-profit organizations. But then you've got this whole other body of work with the Think Good company and your Think Courageously podcast. And that, you talked about pivots. I'm a little sort of circling the campfire here to get to the main point. But your journey through iPEC, you mentioned had you pivoting and thinking about how do you want to show up differently? And to my memory, it started with the Pivot Project and beginning to interview all of these really interesting women. And so if you would give a little backstory on how that project began and how it kind of, brought you to where you are right now.
I think it's
handle it however you'd like.
Well, I think it's worth sharing a little bit of what I consider to be my unique journey in iPEC, which is that I very tragically, unexpectedly, traumatically lost my mom in September of 2018. She had been supportive of me becoming a coach, but I actually found my mom, and it was without a doubt the most traumatic experience of my life. And I had signed up, I can't remember exactly the timing, but I had signed up and was committed to doing the coaching. And so my first module was in March of that year. And so I'd been going through a pretty traumatic grief process and journey before starting my first mod. And my dad died in September of that next year, 364 days later. And I share this because it's very personal, but it's also really important to my journey. My coaching cohort from iPEC went on this journey with me. They were part of my grief journey. They were there for me during this incredible, horrible time in my life. And to be doing, as all of you know, to be doing the work that we do to get through our certification, man, I'm just going to say it was painful. It was powerful. It was life-changing in every way for me. And one of the things that happened during that time was, that message I just shared about not being the expert was a message that had been boomed, volume up super high from my mom. My mom had always shown up as the expert in the room. She didn't tolerate much else. And so as I started to understand the gremlin work in my own journey, I realized that was something that I became very intrigued by, this notion of like my own self-editing and what that was looking like in the way that I was showing up. And as a result of that, something came up for me in this work that was around how we can think courageously. And that concept of thinking courageously led me to, well, how am I going to share what I'm learning about courage and being very intentional about the word courage, I'm going to say, not choosing hope or brave or resilient or anything else, but really intentionally choosing the word courage. How can I share this message of my own experience of thinking and living courageously with others? And I came up with this concept of the, thinking courageously, which is one of the big programs in the Think Good company. And a part of that is the Pivot Project. And the Pivot Project is a 6-month, really an incubator, an opportunity for women to be in community with one another around how successful women can think courageously about pivots, what that means. And so that came from there. But also kind of a funny story. I had this like intuition that this was happening for me, that something different was happening for me around this thinking courageously piece of things. And I was like, I could do a podcast, no big deal. Yet learning how to do that and share my story in an authentic way without oversharing, without all of those things was really important. And so I connected the dots through other iPEC coaches to find somebody to help me with my storytelling. And as I did that work, so much more of this program came into clarity for me. And so much of the work that I do now, I've interviewed over 75 women who are on a journey, who have identified themselves as thinking courageously. And I give them the opportunity to pick 3 words: success, courage, and pivots, in reflecting before the podcast. And what's fascinating, Carla, is 99% of these women choose the word courage. So there's something about being in action and, being in a place of consciousness that is connected to being courageous and living a courageous life.
That's fascinating. That small little fact, those 3 words, courage, over and over again, that resonates at a deep level with these women that you're talking to. And are there themes that you have picked up? I mean, that's a lot of interviews. What bubbles to the top, if that's not too...
Yeah, I've actually worked hard at identifying that, going back through, and I've actually found 10 characteristics of women who think courageously. And they range from courage lives on a continuum, as do pivots. So some of us are forced into a situation where we are called upon to think courageously. And for me, courage is facing multiple challenges and having the belief that there's something on the other side. So we're experiencing the challenges and we know that there's something on the other side. So that courage lives on a continuum. Sometimes it's a small change that somebody needs to make. Sometimes it's somebody who's going through a profound experience like I went through. Maybe they're getting a divorce, or somebody shows up and says, I'm leaving you. I've been having an affair with somebody. It's more of a traumatic pivot and call to courage, but it lives on a continuum. I think that's one of the pieces. And wherever that lives for people, we honor that. We honor that. They come in all sizes. Pivots come in all sizes, and courage comes in a lot of different ways. One that I think that this group would find really interesting is that women who think courageously really trust their intuition and lean into their intuition. And I think that's really interesting because of the work that we do and the energy work that we do. Another example is that they find their community and they love them hard, right? So finding communities where you can show up fully and authentically, whether it's their own communities, many of these people have built communities, virtual communities, or whether they're part of communities like an iPEC family, My community of my abundance circle is an important community. The community that I've built for other women, called Think Courageously, which you can find on Facebook, is a place where people get to practice. Courage is a muscle. It doesn't happen once. We can have a brave moment, but to think courageously, we are building a muscle all the time. We're building a courage mindset. So those are three. We're resourceful. We eat an elephant one bite at a time. There's a bunch of them, but that's a glimpse into the kind of lessons that we have. And what's interesting is that women I have interviewed women who have experienced so many different kinds of challenges. Yesterday, I interviewed a woman who was in a fire when she was 2, and she experienced 75% burns on her body. I've interviewed a couple of women who've lost children, who have started from a place where they were bankrupt and they've built successful businesses. So I think it is really important to honor the fact that courage does live on this continuum, and that we all have a really powerful story to tell around how we can think courageously.
Are these women aware that they're courageous? I know that's a weird question, but I'm because sometimes we were talking about it before. We just exist. We keep going. We one foot in front of the other. Do you find that they are aware, or does it take having that conversation with you and focusing on it to put those pieces together?
I think they oftentimes self-identify. So in the podcast world, you're putting out your content. And so in maybe a podcast community, and so people are saying, well, I have a story to tell. So I think that women who identify with having a powerful story, an impactful story, often are those that are drawn to the show. And one of my favorite things to do is interview my clients when they're through a coaching process to talk about what they've learned. And what's interesting for me is, as you mentioned the book, one of the things that I found really interesting about writing my chapter and working in a collaborative with 14 other women, 3 of whom are iPEC coaches, is that as iPEC coaches, we've done a lot of work on our stories. And so our ability to share that can be really interesting and powerful. And I think we're aware that we've got something, right? It's like that concept that we talk about in iPEC that, who are we to dim our own light? Who are we to dim our own light when we have a story that could really be life-changing for somebody else?
Energy attracts like energy, is what I'm hearing. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I think I admire so much about you is your continuous quest for knowledge and practicing what you preach. So it was, you went through iPEC's program, but you sought out coaches, right? It's walking the talk. And so that continuous ability to recognize where you want to grow and realizing that we're stronger together, that we can grow faster when we open ourselves up to support. And that in and of itself, I think, is a portrait of courage, to acknowledge what you know, what you don't know, and to say, I want to get better and I'm asking for help. So I just wanted to share that, because I do think that is something that sometimes goes overlooked. And that is courage, to ask.
And to ask for help, for sure. And, I would also just put one thing out there, which is that sometimes I think to myself, like, I've built this business from exactly where you see me, and I've been able to take it so far on my own. And I think this is one of the challenges for us when we're solopreneurs and we're building our businesses. And I have really asked for help many times on how can I learn something new to share with my clients, a new technology. I just launched an online course. What do I know? And I'm also a 50-something, almost 60 in a month, entrepreneur. Like, I didn't come to this space without having to really learn a ton and work on my own mindset. So I think, I practice what I preach, in that I think that what we do is around competence and confidence. We have to develop a competency in our coaching and in the skills that we use and navigating this digital world. And we have to have some confidence. And that obviously comes from, working with coaches and other women. I just jumped into a really intensive 2-year coaching program with other women who are, making 6 figures in their business and who want to double and triple their business. And that's where I'm at right now. I'm going all in and really seeing what I can do in the next 2 years.
I have no doubt that you will accomplish it all. I've been hogging the floor and I'm watching the time, and we do have a few minutes left. So for those of you who are listening, if you have questions for Deb, please pop them into the chat. The chat will live on Facebook, so you can continue to post your questions. We've also added information so that you can learn more about Deb. You can find out where she is on her website. And then, of course, if you have other questions about iPEC, about taking your own coach training journey, that's what our admissions coaches are here for. So we've given you a link to click on if you'd like to book a conversation with one of our admissions coaches so that you can hear more about the iPEC journey. So we've got all of that in the chat for you. So Deb, just quickly, you've just been published in a book. This is your first time author. And the book comes out on April 6th. What was that process like for you to put into words your story?
Funny that you would ask that, Carla, because I just wrote a blog today about this very topic, and my podcast on Friday will be about this topic. I am going to say that it's one of the hardest things that I've done. And there are 2 sides to that quickly. One is that I explored a lot of topics that I could write about for this book. And the topic that came back to me over and over again was telling this 364-day grief journey. So my chapter is called Living and Grieving with Courage. And so sometimes we have a story that we want to tell, and sometimes we have a story that we need to tell. And I was just noting today in this writing process that I was going through that I think that for me, I started it was a kind of a selfish approach, like it was going to give me some closure. But as I've gone through the work on this, I hope that other people who are going through their own grief journey will find some solace in what I've shared, and that it is a journey. And that there's, sacred spaces were super important to me in my healing. And so I'm really excited to share that piece of things. And I think for me, the other really affirming piece of this journey has been, it was a collaborative project, 14 other women. We had accountability partners. We had to keep showing up for each other. We're continuing to show up as we market the book for each other. And for me, I'm a really good starter and not always a great finisher. And to have this as a legacy for, when I gave this copy of the book to my daughter, I don't want to get emotional, but it was very powerful for me that it is something that is a forever legacy. And it also honors my mom and my dad in a way that makes me proud.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
Thanks.
We've got a question.
Sure.
Cindy has shared that she's on the board of a small nonprofit whose executive director is definitely a 4, and she believes is exhausted, although trying to hold it together as she has cared for low-income high school seniors and disadvantaged kids and overwhelmed staff through COVID. So very similar to what we were talking about. What are the top actions a board can take to support this executive director?
Get them a coach. I think what's interesting is I decided to do this work because I work for a large nonprofit that had access to a lot of resources. Most nonprofits are not investing in their people in this way. Mm-hmm. And what I'm finding is it is critical. Mm-hmm. It is like mission critical to support people. And my belief is that what really lights me up is I could have stayed in the nonprofit space and as a CEO for an indefinite period of time. And I knew that if I could bring my coaching to these people, that their impact on their organizations, on their communities, and the greater world would be exponentially different. And that's what drives me every day. So honestly, making sure that there's space for those conversations, whether it's with a coach or, making this conversation around self-care. This article, this Harvard Business Review article, is actually a really good article because it talks about being a role model, a lot of things. And again, it's called Leading an Exhausted Workforce. And it was in Harvard Business Review on March 25th. So yeah, I think professional development has changed. Especially in the nonprofit space. I used to love going to conferences. Those opportunities aren't available. So invest in a coach, whether it's somebody who has an expertise in nonprofit coaching or somebody who can support people in that confidence and helping them create those boundaries.
Yeah. And that truly is the ripple effect that we talk about, right? If we are not supporting those, either at the top or that are critical to the whole structure, the rest is just kind of floating. And so affect that individual, and the ripple effects are endless. So good answer. And Cindy, thank you for that question. Really appreciate it. So we are getting to the close of this amazing conversation. It has been such a pleasure to spend time with you as always, Deb, and the work that you are doing is the ripple effect. Let's just go back to that. The ripple effect is endless. And, the areas that we've touched on today in terms of depleted energy and the things that we can focus on to really help those level 4s, work that energy up to a 5 so that they are, able to do more, see more, be more creative, and continue to do the important work that they're doing, which is so critical in the world right now. So thank you for your information, your inspiration, your expertise, your openness, and for sharing your time with us today. And again, I'll just remind everybody that you can find Deb's website in the chat section. Go check out the blog post because it seems very relevant to our conversation today. The book is out April 6th. The podcast is wherever you listen to your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, you name it. And of course, join us again. I believe our next coach, we have our next program, I think is April, I want to say April 7th. The coach is in. You get to sit and have a cup of coffee with some coaches and learn more about what it means to be a coach or to go through iPEC's coach training program. Everybody stay well, be healthy, enjoy, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.